5 miners vanished in Appalachia, and for 80 long years, their story was sealed beneath the mountain. Their names slipped into whispers, their families left with nothing but silence. And then, in 2022, a forgotten mine shaft was uncovered, revealing the truth and reopening a wound that had never healed. This is not just the story of 5 men. It is the story of Appalachia itself. A story of sacrifice, of what America is built upon, and what it chooses to forget. To understand this tragedy, we must go back to the world of 1942. The Appalachian Mountains stretched wide and endless, their ridges cloaked in pine and mist. From a distance, they looked eternal, almost gentle. But beneath that green canopy lay darkness, black veins of coal that fueled a nation at war, powered trains, lit factories, and kept families alive through paychecks scraped from the earth. Coal was king. And the men who clawed it from the mountains, they were its subjects. At dawn, the day began the same as it always did. A single shrill whistle split the morning air.
I think we should take
It was
this
the
route.
sound every miner
That makes
knew.
sense. It avoids the
It pulled them
mountains.
from beds still warm with sleep, from wives whose eyes always lingered just a little too long on their husbands' faces, from children who stirred as boots scraped across wooden floors. The town came alive in those pre-dawn hours. Men trudged toward the mine entrance in groups, shoulders hunched, helmets hanging loose in their hands. The steel clink of lunch pails echoed in rhythm with their boots. Their wives stood in doorways, shawls wrapped tight, holding children against their skirts. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. The silence said it all. Not every man who went down would come back up. Coal towns were built on dependence. The company owned everything, the houses, the store, sometimes even the churches. Pay came not in dollars but in company scrip, pieces of paper worth only at the store the company owned. Survival was tied to the very place that threatened to kill them. And above every home hung 2 shadows, the slow suffocation of black lung, and the sudden death of a collapse. Still the men went willingly. Not because they loved the mines but because coal kept their families fed. Inside, the mine was like another universe. Darkness so complete it felt alive. A single helmet lamp could only carve out a halo of light, barely enough to see the man working beside you. The air smelled of damp earth and coal dust. Water dripped endlessly, echoing off stone walls. The timber beams creaked and groaned under the unimaginable weight of the mountain pressing down. Men worked bent over, backs aching, coughing as the dust filled their lungs. Picks struck rock. Shovels scraped. Carts screeched along rails as they hauled coal toward the surface. Every sound, a crack, a snap, a low rumble, could mean danger. And yet, in that blackness, bonds were forged. Men shared whispered stories. They sang hymns softly to steady their nerves. They relied on each other in ways only those who walked in darkness together could understand. Among them were 5 men, Thomas, Samuel, Jacob, Daniel, and Elijah. 5 friends bound not by blood but by labor. They had worked together long enough to know each other's rhythms, each other's fears. In the mine, trust meant survival. Then came the day the mountain swallowed them. It was cold that morning in 1942. Frost clung to the windows. Families hugged a little tighter at the door. And then the men marched toward the mine, helmets in hand, unaware that they were walking into history. They descended into the shaft. The world above faded into silence. And below, the darkness greeted them like it always did. Hours passed. Picks struck stone. Carts rattled. Men coughed into the dust. And then, it began. A sound first, faint like a groan buried deep in the earth. Timber supports shivered. The ground trembled. And then in one violent roar the mountain gave way. Supports snapped like bones. Dust exploded into the air, choking the tunnels. The earth itself seemed to scream as rock cascaded down, filling passages, crushing timbers, swallowing light. Above ground, windows rattled in the small town. Pots fell from shelves. Children screamed. Mothers froze in their doorways. They knew that sound. The mountain had taken men before. But this collapse was different. It felt bigger. Deeper. More final. Inside the mine, panic erupted. Men scrambled, choking, blinded by dust. Lamps went out. Voices cried out in the darkness. And when the rumbling stopped, silence pressed in like a weight heavier than the mountain itself. 5 men never emerged. Their names became prayers whispered into the cold air above the mine entrance. Their wives and children waited, clutching lanterns, clutching hope. Rescue crews rushed in, lanterns flickering, boots sliding on rubble as they fought through collapsing passages. One widow would later recall, "We stood in the cold, lanterns in our hands, praying. Every time they brought someone up, we prayed it was ours. But it never was." For days rescuers clawed at the earth. They dug until their hands bled. But the deeper they went, the more unstable it became. Dust filled their lungs. The mountain groaned warnings. And then the decision came. The company called off the rescue. The shaft was sealed. The 5 miners declared lost forever. Families screamed, begged, demanded more. But their voices were drowned out by cost, by convenience, by silence. The mine was closed. The truth buried along with them. And the town was left with absence. When the shaft was sealed, silence fell over the town. Not just the silence of the mine, but of voices swallowed by grief. The families of Thomas, Samuel, Jacob, Daniel, and Elijah were left standing at the entrance, their lanterns still glowing, their hearts still clinging to hope. But with every stone laid to close the mine, that hope dimmed. And in its place grew anger. The company told them to move on. They said the rescue was too dangerous. They said the men were gone. And yet, whispers spread through the town. Some swore they had heard faint knocks echoing from the sealed shaft in the first nights after the collapse. Others claimed they heard muffled cries, like voices buried under stone. One child would later say, "My mama swore she heard her brother calling from the ground. She said she never stopped hearing it in her dreams." But no official came to listen. No effort was made to dig again. The shaft was left, covered, forgotten. The families had to live with that silence. Widows grew old telling the story to their children, warning them never to trust the company's promises. Children grew up in houses heavy with absence, where a chair at the table remained empty, where laughter had been stolen. As the decades passed, the mine became a ghost. Nature reclaimed it. Weeds grew thick. The wooden entrance rotted. New generations walked past, barely aware of the tragedy beneath their feet. But the story never fully died. In porches lit by kerosene lamps, old voices would lower when speaking of it. Some said the men had died instantly. Others believed they had survived for days, trapped in the dark, waiting for help that never came. The uncertainty was its own cruelty. 80 years passed. The world changed. Wars were fought and ended. Industries rose and fell. Technology shrank distances and lit up the night sky. But under one Appalachian mountain, 5 men remained where they had fallen. Until 2022. It was a storm that brought them back. A brutal storm that ripped through the valley, tearing down trees and battering an old family farm. On that farm stood a barn, its boards weathered gray, its roof sagging with age. The storm toppled it in a single night. The next morning, as the family picked through the wreckage, the ground beneath the barn sagged. At first, they thought it was just a sinkhole. Then looking closer, they saw wood, timbers worn and cracked but still holding form. Curious, they lowered a light into the hollow. What they saw was no cellar. It was a tunnel. A shaft sealed away by time. They called the authorities. Soon, the quiet farm was alive with activity. Trucks arrived. Investigators set up floodlights. Ropes and braces were lowered into the shaft. For the first time in 80 years, men entered that darkness again. What they found inside was not just history. It was memory preserved. Rusting helmets, straps still intact. Shovels and picks dropped mid-swing. Lunch pails dented, one still containing crumbs of bread wrapped in wax paper. Time had stilled them, leaving them as they were in 1942. And then, the most haunting discovery. A leather-bound Bible. Its cover worn but still intact. Inside, a name written in faded ink, Samuel R. It was no longer legend. The 5 men were real. Their story, their suffering, their silence was real. Word spread quickly. News cameras gathered. Families, now spanning 3 generations, came to the site. For some, it was the first time they had stood where their grandfather or great-grandfather had vanished. One man, Elijah's grandson, stood with tears streaming down his face and said, "All my life my grandmother told me he was still down there. The company told her to forget. But she never did. And today she was proven right." The shaft was treated as sacred ground. Investigators worked slowly, carefully. Every object was cataloged, photographed, preserved. But the discoveries raised more questions than answers. Why had the rescue been abandoned so quickly? Could the men have survived longer than the company claimed? Were they alive for hours, days, waiting, praying in the dark, their faith holding them as hope slipped away? The possibility was almost unbearable. And so, grief mingled with anger. Anger not only at the mountain, but at the men who had sealed the shaft, who had silenced the truth. And this rediscovery in 2022 did more than reopen an old wound. It reminded America that this was not just the tragedy of 5 miners. It was the tragedy of an entire industry. Because mining disasters did not stop in 1942. In 2006, the Sago Mine disaster trapped 13 miners in West Virginia. Families gathered in the freezing cold, clinging to the hope of rescue. For nearly 2 days they prayed. Then came the news: 12 were dead. Only one man survived. In 2010, the Upper Big Branch mine disaster ripped through West Virginia again. 29 miners were killed in an instant. The worst U.S. mining disaster in 4 decades. Investigations later revealed it had been preventable. Safety warnings ignored. Corners cut. Lives traded for profit. The rediscovery of Thomas, Samuel, Jacob, Daniel, and Elijah was not just history resurfacing. It was a mirror. Proof that the same choices, the same silences, still haunt America. The mine gave jobs. It gave coal. It powered cities and factories. But it also demanded silence. And too often it buried names along with coal. The 5 miners' story is not just about death. It's about truth. About how silence does not erase history. It only buries it, until one day the earth itself gives it back. Forgotten does not mean gone. Silence does not mean peace. And even 80 years later, truth matters. And so, as we close this tale, I want to leave you with this. The story of the 5 miners is not just something to listen to and then forget. It is a mirror held up to all of us. A reminder of what happens when truth is buried, when voices are silenced, when sacrifice is written off as the cost of progress. And that is why I tell these stories. Because silence should never be the last word. Because their voices deserve to echo again, through time, through generations, through us. So if this story touched you, if it made you stop and think about the price of survival, about the lives lived and lost in the shadows of our history, then I ask you to take a moment now. Subscribe to this channel, not for me but for them. For the men whose names would have been erased, if not for those who kept remembering. Every subscription, every share, every comment, it's more than numbers. It is a refusal to let silence win. It is a way of saying, we hear you, we remember you, and we will not let you be forgotten again. When you comment, you're not just speaking to me. You're speaking to the families who carried this pain for decades. You're speaking to the future, ensuring that when others search for hidden truths, they will find them here. When you share this video, you're not just passing along a story. You are keeping alive a memory that was almost erased. You're telling the world that these men mattered, that their sacrifice mattered, that their silence deserves to be broken. And when you subscribe, you're joining a community of listeners who believe that history should not just be written by those in power, but by those who lived, who suffered, who endured, who were left behind. Because one day, another tale will surface. Another hidden truth will claw its way out of the shadows. And when it does, I promise you'll hear it here, told with the weight it deserves, told with the pauses, with the silence, with the reverence that memory demands. So let us carry this forward together. Let us remember. Let us share. Let us refuse to let the silence of the past bury the truth of those who came before us. Because mountains may swallow men. Time may cover their names. But if we keep telling their stories, they will never truly be gone.